To preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of Ellroy reads. Hello, Happy New Year. 2025 is going to be a tumultuous year politically, I suspect. And this month, January, is inauguration month, so I thought, what better month than to do as my book this week, Dutch, a Memoir of Ronald Reagan. So if you're unfamiliar with Ellroy Reads, this is the basic format. Every week I look at a book that was highly influential to the development of James Ellroy as a writer, a book that inspired him, moved him, amused him, perhaps shocked him. And Dutch, a Memoir of Ronald Reagan, is highly important for a number of reasons. One is it's quite an unusual choice for Ellroy in that his political conservatism is sometimes at odds, not with the subject matter, Ronald Reagan, one of the greatest Republican presidents, but at odds with the kind of tone and the structure of the book, which is somewhat irreverent, and the structure is highly unconventional and caused a lot of controversy in biographical circles. So let me give you some background. Firstly, Edmund Morris was born in Nairobi, Kenya, to South African parents. He was raised partly in South Africa, where he began his career as a writer in copywriting for products aimed specifically at the Zulu market. Then he moved to Britain, where he continued his copywriting career. He finally moved to the United States, where he would eventually make his home, becoming a United States citizen. And he began his literary career in quite spectacular style. His first book, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. So an absolutely astonishingly strong start to what continued to be an extraordinary literary career and an astonishingly very few debut books you have that distinction. So it really put him at the top of the kind of field of biographers. It was published in 1979, and subsequently Reagan came to power, came to the White House, and there was some negotiation between Reagan's top White House aides and Morris about him taking on the role of being Ronald Reagan's authorized biographer. And he had a number of meetings with Reagan in the early days of his presidency. And eventually he was given a kind of open door pass to accompany Reagan on a number of official events and be a kind of in-house, White House historian. He could sit in on certain meetings. He could speak to Reagan semi-regularly, although there were obviously massive demands on Reagan's time. And the book that was eventually produced came out in 1999, a long time after Reagan had left office, and by this time he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and he had made the diagnosis public. He'd withdrawn from public life for health reasons. So the book eventually comes out, and because expectation was so high, it shot right to the top of the bestseller lists. But then when the reviews came out, because they were so mixed and divisive, it actually dropped off its hold at the top of the bestsellers list very, very quickly. Why is this book so divisive? Well, some people could argue that it's not even biography. Morris uses a number of very, very unconventional techniques. First of all, it's essentially his autobiography, or a fictional version of Edmund Morris, because he talks about growing up with Dutch in the same town. As their lives diverge as young people, Morris creates a number of fictional characters who are essentially kind of mutual friends of Ronald Reagan and him. And they're keeping Morris abreast of everything Reagan's doing in his life. So really you're reading kind of a novel of Edmund Morris's life, in which he's periodically checking in, because he says he's not having much contact with Reagan, he's just having contact with people who know him, saying, hey, how's Ronnie Reagan doing? How's he doing as the lifeguard? one of the recurring stories in this is that Ronald Reagan saved 77 people's lives when he was a lifeguard. How's his acting career going? How about his marriage? Is he man about town, and on all of those sorts of things? So naturally, it the structure kind of angered um, biography readers and many biography commentators. It isn't until very, very late in the book, when you actually get to Reagan's presidency, and when, in, in actual fact, Morris's life and Reagan's life began to dovetail, because they're both essentially in the White House. That one's an observer, one's a participant, but they're in very, very close proximity. That a lot of these kind of facades or devices are actually dropped, and it begins to read much more as a straight biography. Now, James Ellroy told me several times he was a big admirer of this book, and I thought that was unusual for a number of reasons. Firstly, I wasn't surprised in terms of Ellroy being an admirer of Ronald Reagan, and therefore wanting to read everything that has ever been written about Ronald Reagan. He'd also talk a few times about Lou Cannon's books on Ronald Reagan, and Lou Cannon wrote several volumes of biography on Reagan, and Ellroy actually said that Cannon was Reagan's harshest biographer, although, to be fair, Cannon did dedicate his life to the study of Ronald Reagan. This book is so irreverent that I was reading it and I was kind of surprised that any kind of Republican or conservative or just Reagan admirer, whether you're apolitical or not, could actually like it, because it's very scathing in some of its critiques of Reagan. So it's kind of implied that he didn't have a particularly good acting career, although that's not particularly controversial, but it's implied that he's not a very good actor. But it's also implied, and this seems to be a contradiction in terms, that he was acting all the time. In fact, Morris continually comes back to this point of saying, even his fictional self, who knows him from childhood, and his actual self, who knows him in adulthood, that I never really felt I got to know him. But it's almost like he's saying, one of the reasons I couldn't write a straight biography of him is there's nothing to really pull the curtain back on. Reagan seems to believe everything he says, and of course, like Trump, like Bush, like Biden, he makes a lot of big gaffes, big factual gaffes in his speeches. But Morris says, somewhat sympathetically, says, like, well, when you're president, you're absorbing information all the time. You're reading about economic statistics, and then you're reading about immigrant statistics, and then you're reading about who's the head of state and who's the head of government in this African country or whatnot. Naturally, it's going to get scrambled, especially for a man who became president in his 70s. But there's also stuff in here that I was kind of shocked by. I mean, some of the devices, like Morris's original title for it was The Ronald Reagan Story. And he writes at times saying, like, well, what if I was making a documentary called The Ronald Reagan Story? What if I was directing it? Here's how I would script it. Here's how I would set up the shot. And you have these kind of elaborate descriptions of cameras panning down over autumn leaves on the White House steps and that sort of thing. But there's also descriptions like about Reagan not being particularly sexual, like almost not being a man's man, particularly in his first marriage to Jane Wyman, who was an absolute sex pot, or real beautiful, voluptuous woman, and there's kind of things about him really not being much of a good husband to her. But then there's rumors that he after the divorce he was kind of tomcatting around town. So there's a lot of stuff here that will just kind of make your jaw drop. And you think to yourself, in a way, there's a kind of God bless America to it, because this is the leader of the free world, Ronald Reagan, a man who can declare war on any country in the world, or the most powerful man in the world, and he authorizes this biography. You think perhaps slightly against his better judgment, and it turns out to be this kind of like massively unconventional, highly irreverent, almost scabrous and quite scathing of him at times, I thought, account. And there's definitely no dictatorships where that would ever happen. I don't think there's many other democracies where that would ever happen, frankly. And then when the book came out, some of the views were absolutely scathing. Joan Didion accused it of basically being Republican propaganda because it skips over the Iran-Contra gate, or Iran-Contra, I should just call it. We put gate on the word of everything in Britain. The Iran-Contra scandal. Actually, very little time is dedicated to that. You do see some glimpses of Oliver North, and he comes across as a bit of a charlatan. And you think, how did these people ever get into these positions of power? And a huge amount of time in the latter half is spent on the disarmament talks with Gorbachev. So I kind of see, in one sense, you might think, okay, well, that might just be Republican propaganda, just repeating the legend of Reagan's achievements. But at the end of the day, he wants to spend a lot of time on what Ronald Reagan considered his crowning achievement. With regards to Iran-Contra, and this might be more of an indictment than anything, Morris seems to suggest Reagan didn't actually know that much about it. So, almost like either his mental faculties were already failing him at this stage in the second term of his presidency, or that there's a cabal of basically intelligence operatives and borderline criminals and who are running this highly complicated arms scheme. So it is an irreverent book, and I suppose it's a tough read. It's a tough read because sometimes the irreverence I felt was intrusive. Morris's last ever meeting with Reagan is shortly after the diagnosis has been made public, and you can tell that Reagan is not there, so to speak, that he's in very poor health. And I thought that was kind of intrusive. As a biographer myself, I felt like, why is he saying these things? He also creates this scene imagining Reagan's last years, like him almost like walking around confused, and Secret Service agents, kind of put him in back in his chair and this sort of thing. And I thought that was, kind of intrusive of anyone, least of all, president. In terms of the structure, it takes a little getting used to. But I think, having read the book 20 years or so after it was published, and after all of the controversy has wound down, knowing a little bit about the controversy of the book going in, I probably enjoyed it more because I knew what to expect, and I could take it on that level. I could take it, the very, very unconventional structure. I could appreciate it, and I think, recommending it to you, if you haven't read it now I've given away some of the controversy, you can go in and maybe appreciate the novelistic aspects of it, appreciate the experimental aspects of it, and then finally maybe appreciate the more formal aspects of it when it finally gets to the presidency, when the two lives converge. I never really got to the bottom of the mystery as to why Ellroy likes it so much, although one can imagine as a novelist, he's essentially doing the same things in historical fiction. With the LA Quartet, with the Underworld USA trilogy, even though, particularly the latter series, the Underworld USA series, even though these novels suggest that the underworld is where we have the true power, i.e. organized crime, rogue intelligence operatives, that seems to be Ellroy's thesis, is that that's where the true power is held. Nevertheless, the presidency is highly important to these novels. The American tabloid ends with, and everything is geared towards the assassination of JFK, and therefore the abrupt end to the presidency. The Cold 6000 ends with the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, which is essentially engineered to deprive him of the presidency and deprive America of that leadership. So I think maybe Ellroy liked this as for its novelistic qualities, for what really Edmund Morris was doing in historical fiction. And maybe I never asked him this directly, but maybe he felt that it was kind of soft on Reagan, which is what some kind of liberal reviewers really felt, particularly I mentioned Joan Didion. I didn't think it was soft on Reagan at all. I don't think that you can write a biography of a man and say he's kind of shallow, he's superficial, you can never really get to know him, and then really, really put him amongst the greats. Um, but maybe there's a case for that. I don't think Morris is making that case, but he's saying like, well, Reagan wasn't well read, definitely wasn't an intellectual, wasn't like an Obama type president, but he certainly had the common touch. And his election victories, he was, despite his advanced age, he was winning with every single age bracket over 18 in the American electorate. So sure, I mean, there's greatness there. I know I'm not denying it. Reading this, I thought Edmund Morris was denying it. But many kind of conservative commentators, such as Ellroy himself, and not to mention Reagan's children actually quite liked the book. 3 of Reagan's children came out and said that he actually really captured our father, which is ironic because he's saying he's beyond kind of capturing in any kind of deep sense. Anyway, it is a very interesting book. If you like your biographies to be avant-garde, then I think you're going to absolutely love it. If not, maybe stay away. Or if you're somewhere in the middle, I'd say go in, read it with an open mind. Don't fight the structure. Don't fight the kind of numerous tricks that Morris has up his sleeve. And, it might surprise you. You might really, really like it. And it's what you will think of it in terms of how it portrays Ronald Reagan will also be really, really interesting because it seems to have some very, very divisive results. Okay, thank you. It's good to be back. It's good to be in 2025. Thank you for watching. Why don't you hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and hit that share button and share the show with all your friends. Okay, I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.